our job was to tell them that everything is good. Then we will lose our jobs and we would never get them back. Approximately 2 months after the explosion, I spent a total of about 30 days examining patients who live in the most contaminated areas. We were told very strictly not to tell the population that anything is wrong.
Sand, boron, clay and lead were dropped onto the flames. The Soviets then tried clearing debris with remote-controlled robots. But when the machine started breaking down in the toxic atmosphere, groups of men were brought in to clear 100 tons of radioactive material from the area.
Workers in Chernobyl had 90 seconds to do their job at a time, but at what cost to their lives? And what jobs were oh so important that it was worth the sacrifice? The term liquidator is a broad term used to describe those who worked in the overall cleanup and response to the disaster. Firefighters, construction workers, soldiers, helicopter pilots, miners, animal control squads, so forth and so on are all technically liquidators. Because of this, sources say that there are about 300,000 liquidators out there, but some folks claim this number could be as high as 800,000. Once again, yes, it is a very broad term, and pinpointing who exactly was a liquidator is tough. So because of that, it becomes difficult to find out information about those guys who went on the roofs, who threw radioactively potent materials back into the core, because, well, they don't really have an official name. Oftentimes they were just referred to as roof liquidators, cleanup workers, or just construction workers. 90 seconds though, I want to focus on that. They had 90 seconds to clear the roof of whatever radioactive lead and other debris they could find.
He was working at the Chernobyl power plant when one of the world's worst nuclear accidents unfolded.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
The Soviets are saying little, but what is known is cause for concern: a nuclear accident.
Some folks were shown images, were ordered to pick out specific pieces of debris, but others not so much. Even with this very short time limit, their lives were most likely forever affected, whether it be leukemia or cancer or just a shortened lifespan. Going up on that roof definitely did something to their bodies. When he left his wife and offspring on May 7th of 1986 and went to work, John Crennel didn't know he was going to be one of those people. John and about 200 other men were taken to a nearby school, and once they'd walked through the door, they were not allowed to leave. The men's passports were completely seized before they were loaded onto buses and taken to a forest, where they were told to slip into brand new army uniforms. When the officials finally revealed that they were heading to Chernobyl, the men were almost relieved, because they didn't know much about what had happened. They were happy to not be fighting in a war, and they were led to believe that the radiation levels were practically safe. Jan says that it wasn't uncommon for Soviet authorities to use propaganda and routinely cover up events of public interest, and he believes that not even those in charge immediately knew that they were dealing with the planet's biggest nuclear catastrophe. Jan was, by the way, amongst the first group sent to clean up in the aftermath of everything. Tasked with hosing down radiation on the houses and villages, he was thrown right into the thick of it. These folks mixed water with a washing powder-like substance and measured the radiation levels once the houses had been hosed down. And at the time, these results were so good that he thought, hey, maybe we can really finish up in 2 weeks. But then one time, somebody had an idea that maybe they should return to a village that was hosed down a couple of days earlier and check the levels again. They were shocked to find that the radiation had not only returned, but it got worse. Despite the apparent uselessness of the job, these folks continued to work 11-hour days without a day off. After that, they would have like 2 days of downtime a month. And as weeks rolled on and months rolled on, suspicions grew. And it got to the point where whatever enthusiasm the men initially felt had faded. Concerns grew about whether they were being lied to about the radiation being harmless, and the respirators that these men were given wouldn't stay on because of the heat, and they were used until they got holes in them. Later they found out these things should have been replaced every day for safety. We will never know just how much radiation the many hundreds of thousands of liquidators were exposed to, because it kind of varied. Depending on your specific role and area you worked in, that would kind of influence how much you got exposed to. Only about 2 to 3% of these liquidators actually had like meters that they could measure things with, and even that was not reliable. Apparently it was like a 50-50 chance, which I don't know about you, but I don't want to stake my life on a 50-50 chance. For the roof workers specifically, we know that their lives and bodies were altered in some way, shape, or form no matter what, and they had to continue working on other construction or cleanup tasks near wherever they were. So even though they were doing this and that and everything else, they were still being hammered with radiation. Even before going up onto rooftops, these liquidators were talking about experiencing coughs, and despite their growing fears, they were reluctant to confide in each other. And then, a shimmer of hope. There was a rumor that the very last leg of the assignment was just to go up onto the roof, clear off as much debris as possible, and you could go home. Humans were being given a task that remote control robots had previously attempted but failed. Why? Oh, just no big. The machines had simply stopped working because of the unprecedented levels of radiation. So when Jan said, oh, and they told us you have to go on the roof, they were like, oh, okay, cool, we can go home. So on the day, they changed their army uniforms for a protective suit, glasses and a gas mask, a metal guard. All the men were lined up and told, who doesn't want to go up on the roof? But only a couple of folks said no. They realized it had to be done. They couldn't just leave this. A lot of folks realized the longer this reactor is open, the more dangerous it is. So remember that 90 seconds, folks? This is where it comes back into play. Jan was one of the folks shown on a small screen exactly which pieces of debris he was supposed to pick up with a shovel and throw off, but he was strictly warned against going too close to the edge, and he had just a short period of time to complete the assignment, and then a bell would ring to tell him when to book it back. This time frame was meant to limit exposure to radiation because, as we knew it by this point, it could end your life, but the men weren't being told this. They compared it to being in the army, where nobody explains anything. You get an order, you go, and you do it. It's a demand. And Jan said he'll never forget those 2 minutes standing over the edge of an open nuclear reactor, shoveling radioactive graphite. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the fear. Something made him go blank. Because according to him, once he got on the roof, it looked completely different from what was being shown on the screen. So he just grabbed whatever pieces of debris he could. And when he got there, that adrenaline was pumping so hard that he thought he would turn the roof upside down. He didn't even think about what was going to happen to him. He didn't have time to think. It was survival instinct. Pure and simple. Emergency workers also helped to clean up the plant premises and surrounding area. These other workers were mostly plant employees, firefighters, soldiers, miners from all over the Soviet Union. Like I said, the Russian registries list approximately 400,000 liquidators as of 1991, but 600 people were granted the status of liquidator. What's the big deal about the status? These 600,000 individuals received special benefits because of their involvement. So special health care for risking your life. Some folks worked on decontamination, some folks worked on construction, some folks worked on the establishment of settlements and towns for other workers and evacuees. They also built waste areas, dams, water filtration systems, and this is where things get important, the sarcophagus, the thing that entombs the entire fourth reactor to contain the remaining radioactive material. The sarcophagus was not a structure meant to last. This was something built out of pure desperation and panic. In an attempt to contain as much of the radioactive materials as possible, workers were very quickly building this large structure. Often, and by often I mean most of the time, without necessary protective gear. They were rushing to fill in open spaces with thousands of cubic meters of concrete. There were helicopters dropping things directly into the reactor. There was miners everywhere digging to try and avoid runoff from melting through the foundation of the base and into the ground. The entire section of the facility was covered by massive concrete walls, and that's how it got its name, the sarcophagus, because it looked kind of ominous. In the end, the structure was able to prevent hundreds of tons of radioactive contaminants from getting out. But on the other side of the scale, 31 people died of radiation poisoning during or after it was all done. I think construction only took about 5 months. But once again, this was not built to last. The building lacked any kind of bolted joints. There was openings in the roof that have allowed water to seep in and corrode the structure. Thankfully, there has been work to fix that. Work on the new safe confinement at the site started in late 2010 and was moved into position in November of 2016. This was done to prevent the release of the contaminated material from the old shelter, and at the same time, protects the shelter from all the external sort of impacts, like weather. The new structure is an extraordinary landmark. It's wild, and thankfully, this time some care was taken to minimize the risk of workers' exposure to radiation. It was assembled in 2 halves, and these were joined and slid into position. Number 5, don't eat the food. That might be common sense to most of us, but if I've learned anything in my time here on Earth, it's that common sense ain't all too common anymore. Sad as I might be to utter that statement. So let's just say I know a human who has recently visited Chernobyl, and even though they're a brilliant human being, decided to pick an apple off of a tree and consume it. So while I'm thrilled to hear that vegetation is making a comeback in the area, trust me when I say I was making a million Snow White jokes while also concerned for my friend's health. They're not a daredevil per se, but we've made enough Johnny Knoxville jokes together and met through doing work that definitely isn't for everybody. But they're also one of the toughest people I know. I'm just happy to report that the damn apple apparently just tasted really off and made them upchuck like no tomorrow. Which sure, that could trigger a no SHIT Sherlock response from most of us, but maybe there will eventually come a day where it's safe safe to consume from the land there, but not anytime soon, so if you're visiting, leave the apples on the tree. Number 4. Thyroid cancer. Cancers are caused by mutations in human DNA. A few lines of genetic code get deleted or mixed up, and that change allows cells to proliferate and grow in abnormal ways. Sometimes those DNA changes are genetic. People inherit them from their parents, but sometimes they're caused by environmental factors. For years, epidemiological studies have shown that thyroid cancer is particularly common among people exposed to radioactive iodine, especially for folks who were exposed when they were young. At high enough doses, radioactive iodine kills thyroid cells, can actually be used as a treatment for thyroid cancer and other thyroid conditions. But the radiation from Chernobyl wasn't enough to kill cells. Instead, the months-long exposure to lower doses caused changes to the cells that resulted in tumors. Now, in her paper, lead researcher Lindsay Morton and her colleagues were able to take a closer look at the tumors from people who lived near Chernobyl, studying the DNA of over 350 people who developed thyroid cancer after being exposed to radiation when they were young. Through this, they created a comprehensive molecular picture of said tumors. Then, to see how they differed from thyroid cancers caused by other factors, the researchers compared these tumors against tissue from 81 people who were born near Chernobyl after 1986 and developed thyroid cancer but were never exposed to radiation. They also compared the tumors to data from the Cancer Genome Atlas, which has characterized the genomes of thousands of cancers, and found that the cancer cases caused by radioactive iodine exposure following the meltdown had mutated genes by rupturing the twin strands of DNA and breaking them apart. By contrast, the thyroid cancers in the Cancer Genome Atlas and in the control group of 81 unexposed people from the area were more likely to be caused by single-point mutations, where just one single base pair of the DNA is changed. After the disaster, scientists monitored many of the communities near Chernobyl, as well as the workers who were tasked with cleaning up and encasing the radioactive reactor in a steel and concrete sarcophagus. Researchers also did extensive interviews with residents about their indirect exposure. For example, radioactive isotopes from the reactor fell into the surrounding fields and were eaten by grazing cows, transmitting the radiation to their milk and subsequently to the people who drank it. So information about dairy consumption offered clues about how much radiation someone had been exposed to. Physicists and epidemiologists worked together to piece all these direct and indirect measurements into a reconstruction of the radiation doses that the people who donated the tissue samples would have received. Now, this is a unique circumstance where we know a lot about the exposure. Most of the genome landscape studies have no information on where and what the people were exposed to. So this gave researchers an opportunity to take a close look at exactly how this cancer process works. They discovered that the more radiation a person was exposed to, and the younger they were at the time of exposure, the more double-strand DNA breaks they would have. Finally, the team looked at the cancer drivers, the specific genes whose mutations were responsible for tumor growth. They found that the molecular characteristics of the radiation-caused cancers weren't all that different from what has been observed in randomly occurring thyroid cancers. It was only, those double-strand DNA breaks that was different. That's what really was the insight into how radiation is causing cancer. There were no special biomarkers that labeled these cells as having been mutated by radiation, which tells scientists that the effects of the radiation happened early in the carcinogenic process, and the biomarkers, if there were any, were lost or washed out as the cancer grew. That molecular similarity indicates that these cases don't require a novel treatment. These cancers really just look, in the end, like typical thyroid cancers, so there are no specific implications for taking a different treatment approach. The more you know. Number 3. Genetics of dogs left behind. So a population of wild dogs living near the Chernobyl exclusion zone is now giving scientists a glimpse into how long-term radiation exposure affects generations. So yes, this kind of plays into what I was just talking about. The radiation exposure still being emitted in Chernobyl decades after the 1986 nuclear disaster may have fundamentally altered the genetics of dog populations, according to a study published earlier this year in Science Advances. Furthermore, the genetics within dog populations that have been exposed to differing levels of radiation are also distinct from one another, according to researchers. The dogs still living around the exclusion zone are likely descendants of the pets left behind after residents surrounding the power plant fled the region in a hurry, leaving behind all their belongings, including their four-legged companions. The radioactive contamination devastated wildlife populations in the region, but some survived and continued to breed. Researchers used preserved, redness samples collected from more than 300 dogs between 2017 and 2019 in a location with varying levels of contamination by the Chernobyl Dog Research Initiative, as the organization has been providing veterinary care, according to the study. The volunteers began treating and sterilizing the dogs around the same time that construction began for the new safe confinement facility for the nuclear reactor that failed, and there was concern that the dogs living in the area might be a problem. Apparently they're super friendly. Many of the effects that researchers have seen in the dogs and other animals parallel what has been observed in the past with, atomic survivors from Japan. I can't say the word. For instance, they have increased rates of cataracts because the eyes are the first tissues to show signs of chronic exposure to ionizing radiation. Scientists are also looking for other developmental abnormalities, such as tumors, smaller brain sizes, and changes in symmetry. The researchers aim to distinguish the different populations of dogs that live in and near the power plant, as well as in Pripyat, the abandoned town about 2 miles away. The dogs that live in Chernobyl City have a background of Boxer and Rottweiler, while the dogs in Slavutich have more Labrador Retriever in them. Wide genomic variations within and across geographic locations across the Chernobyl exclusion zone suggest the dogs live close to one another, move between sites, and breed freely. Researchers are now poised to determine the genetic progressions of the dogs in the past several generations and look at how they have survived and propagated throughout that time. Although exposure to ionizing radiation is known to elevate genetic mutation rates across various plant and animal species, it is still unclear how larger animals may be impacted at the population level. Even in the shadow of war, researchers and volunteers were able to venture into Chernobyl to treat about 125 animals and obtain more samples, which I guess we'll find out. Number 2, elephant foot. So this is a solidified corium glass composed primarily of silicon dioxide with traces of dissolved uranium, titanium, zirconium, magnesium, and graphite. It was formed during the Chernobyl disaster, from a lava-like mixture. It was formed during the Chernobyl disaster from a lava-like mixture of molten core materials that had escaped the reactor enclosure, materials from the reactor itself, and various structural components of the plant itself, such as concrete and metal. Over time, zircon crystals have started to form slowly within the mass as it cools, and crystalline uranium dioxide dendrites are growing quickly and breaking down repeatedly. Despite the distribution of uranium-bearing particles not being uniform, the radioactivity of the mass is evenly distributed. The mass was quite dense and unyielding to efforts to collect samples for analysis by a drill mounted on a remote-controlled trolley, and armor-piercing rounds fired from an AK-47 were necessary to break off usable chunks. By June of 1998, the outer layers had started turning to dust, and the mass had started to crack, as the radioactive components were starting to disintegrate to a point where the structural integrity of the glass was failing. In 2021, the mass was described as having a similar consistency to sand. It is named for its wrinkly appearance, kind of like an elephant's foot. So when was it this thing was discovered, by the way? Back in December of 1986. It is located in room 217, 15 meters to the southeast of the ruined reactor and 6 meters below ground level. The material making up the foot had burnt through at least 2 meters of reinforced concrete, then flowed through pipes and fissures and down a hallway to reach its current location. So now it's located in a maintenance corridor below the remains of reactor number 4, though the visible elephant's foot is only a part of a larger mass. By the way, it's still an extremely radioactive object, even though the danger has decreased over time due to the decay of its radioactive components, but according to my sources, it's still pretty lethal. Don't go near that. At the time of its discovery, which was about 8 months after formation, radioactivity near the elephant's foot was approximately 8,000 to 10,000 roentgens, or 80 to 100 grays per hour, delivering a 50-50 lethal dose of radiation within 5 minutes. Now, since that time, the radiation intensity has declined significantly, and in 1996, the elephant's foot was briefly visited by the deputy director of the new Safe Confinement Project, who took photographs using an automatic camera and a flashlight to illuminate the otherwise dark room. Now, how does it give off radiation? Alpha particles. As of 2015, measurements of a piece taken from the foot indicated radioactivity levels of roughly 2500 BQ. While alpha radiation is ordinarily unable to penetrate the skin, it is the most damaging form of radiation when radioactive particles are inhaled or ingested, which has renewed concerns as samples of material from the meltdown, including the foot, kind of turn to dust and become aerosols. So wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. Number 1, Reactor 4. So while there are parts of Chernobyl that can now be visited by tourists, there's still a whole lot of area that is completely off limits. Also, if you're visiting as a tourist, it's recommended that you wear clothes that you don't mind burning after your visit, so that you don't get infected. So you can actually visit the control room from Reactor 4, but the radiation in the room is 40,000 times higher than normal levels. It sits under the new containment arch, but outside of the original sarcophagus that contained the radiation of the reactor itself. Now, if you're going to visit the site, you gotta wear a protective suit, a helmet, a mask, and you gotta be there 5 minutes or less. Afterwards, you gotta go radiology tests, a couple of them, to measure the amount of radiation that you were exposed to. Which, that's kind of typical of most tours in Chernobyl. People must go through radiation checkpoints at the beginning, middle, and end of one-day tours. Because if you didn't know, if I haven't been clear enough today, exposure to large amounts of radiation can cause tissue damage and acute sickness, as well as cancer. One area that you absolutely cannot enter, the machine cemetery in the Rosoka village, which is where the contaminated machines used during the cleanup were dumped. Yeah, that's not at the top of my must-see list anytime soon.
Number 5. The Red Forest. In the years since the disaster, the flora and fauna of the area has begun to thrive, taking over much of the area. However, some of this plant life is unlike any you've ever seen due to the massive amounts of radiation in the area. In the time directly after the accident, a woodland in the area filled with normally green pine trees turned bright red and died, being dubbed the Blood Red Forest. What is even more unusual about these trees is that even 20 years after the disaster, these dead trees have not decayed. Most dead trees will rot to dust within a decade, but these red trees have somehow avoided this fate. Scientists gathered bags of red leaves to run tests on their rate of decomposition, finding that they were less decomposed by 30% than regular leaves, and remained intact and dry even after a whole year. This indicates that the ecosystem will have trouble replenishing itself with nutrients, and worst still, that the dry leaves could result in a fire. If that were to happen, it would risk radioactive containments being spread through the air outside of the exclusion zone and into nearby areas it could damage. Other strange ways that the radiation affected the plants in the time after the disaster was some being seen growing or shrinking to unusual sizes, or in some cases, even glowing in the dark. What other ways has the radiation from the Chernobyl disaster affected the plant life of the area that we simply can't see? Is there a way to get one of those red forest trees for my home in time for Christmas, or should I stick to the classic green? Number 4. These creepy dolls. What would a spooky list be without an entry about a creepy doll? There's something about them that puts people on edge, despite being intended as objects of joy and comfort for children. When the city of Pripyat was evacuated the day after the disaster, 49,000 people had to leave their homes with little notice, having very little time to pack their belongings, and most things simply being left behind. They were under the impression that they would be returning home after a short amount of time, so many objects remain where they were abandoned to this day, including the toys of the children of Pripyat. In the years since the disaster, these dolls have begun to radiate and rot, taking on a haunting and disturbing look. Many are left in positions of play, while others have been posed in the years since by urban explorers into positions of a more sinister nature. When wandering through the abandoned town, though, it may be comforting to know that you are not alone, as you are being watched by thousands of dead, glassy doll eyes as you make your way through the empty streets. Number 3. The elephant's foot. At the epicenter of the Chernobyl disaster is a strange mass which has been nicknamed the elephant's foot. The Chernobyl incident was caused when there was a power surge during a routine test that went wrong, resulting in the uranium rods overheating in their cooling water. This caused them to give off a massive amount of steam and pressure, which built up until there were 2 massive explosions. This caused radioactive material to spurt into the atmosphere and for coolant to stop flowing into the reactor. This built up enough thermal energy to melt the fuel rods, causing a molten lava-like material to form, which gives off deadly levels of ionizing radiation. This material then melted through the steel beams and concrete below the reactor and fell into the basement, where it pooled and eventually cooled, causing this combination of uranium, graphite, concrete, and sand to form together into the elephant's foot. This foot's radiation levels were measured shortly after the disaster and were found to be giving off 10,000 Roentgens of ionizing radiation per hour, which would be the equivalent level of millions of chest x-rays at once, which would obviously be extremely fatal. In the years since, the radiation level has decreased significantly, but it still has enough radiation to emit heat and dangerous amount of radiation. When looking at photos of the elephant's foot, it can be hard to believe the amount of pain and suffering the seemingly boring rock in the middle of a basement can cause. But then, the deadliest things often appear harmless at first. Number 2. The Ghost of Reactor IV. In 1997, a physicist from the University of Buffalo visited the Chernobyl power plant and had a strange and frightening experience while in Reactor IV, the ground zero of the Chernobyl disaster. He arrived at 7:30 in the morning and went right into the Reactor IV sarcophagus to begin his work. He was taking readings when he heard the faint sound of a voice. At first, he thought it was simply his imagination, but the voice continued to get louder and its words began to get clearer. The voice was frantically screaming and begging for help in putting out a fire. The physicist ran upstairs to inform the officials who had brought him there, but after explaining what he had heard to them, they looked at him with confusion and informed him that he was the first person to enter the location in 3 whole years. Aside from that, in order to enter the site, the alleged firefighter would have had to enter a password and scan his handprint to get through the doors. Otherwise, the alarm would have sounded. If all that is true, what was it that the physicist heard? Was it a vivid auditory hallucination, or the sounds of a specter from the past of a worker who saw the initial damage that would lead to the plant's meltdown, and did everything in their power to prevent it? Other paranormal activity has been reported from the site, with investigators from the sci-fi television program Destination Truth witnessing what appeared to be a human figure running through the reactor while they filmed with an infrared camera. Another strange occurrence actually took place in the days leading up to the disaster, with locals reporting strange sights. Workers at the plant reported seeing a black, gigantic, bird-like creature with glowing red eyes and a 20-foot wingspan. This creature was dubbed the Black Bird of Chernobyl, and those who saw it claimed to suffer terrible nightmares and menacing phone calls, which got progressively worse until the day of the accident. Similar creatures have been reported in the past, in the build-up to disasters all over the world, such as the Mothman creature, who apparently plagued the residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the lead-up to the Silver Bridge failure, which took 46 lives in 1967. Are these creatures harbingers of doom, who show up to feed off of the fear and anxiety of an area before a tragedy? Are they somehow responsible for the mistakes that led to these disasters? When will they be seen again? Only time will tell. Number 1. Mutated Animals. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, there were a lot of questions being asked about the long-term effects of the radiation on the area. One of these was how it would affect the local wildlife. The disaster had caused hundreds of people to die or contract cancer, and others were being born with birth defects. So, scientists believed that wildlife in the area would die off and come to avoid the site. They were shocked to find that wildlife had actually come back much sooner than they had expected. Of course, a wild animal with a severe birth defect won't last very long in the wild without being killed. So, there have been relatively few wild mutated animals seen in Chernobyl. That doesn't mean that the wildlife is normal. Although most of the animals in the exclusion zone are free from glowing skin or extra body parts, they do carry a huge amount of radiation. In the early 90s, a wild boar was killed near Chernobyl and was found to have 2,000 times the amount of radiation that is considered safe for a human to consume. 2,000 times the amount of radiation that is considered safe for a human to consume. If physically deformed animals are what you are interested in, you would have better luck at nearby farms, as there have been significantly more examples of mutations seen in the domestic and farm animals left in the area. A decade after the accident, reports started coming in of animals being born with deformed faces, strange colors, multiple muzzles and heads, as well as extra legs. Some of the more infamous examples include a lamb with 8 legs, a cat with 2 faces, a calf with legs growing out of its back, and another with 2 faces. Would you ever take on one of these deformed animals as a pet, or would the extra head prevent you from loving your cute and cuddly new friend?
Coming in at number 5, we have fish specimen. So this is definitely a disturbing discovery. Prior to the nuclear disaster, there was a fish farm located on the shoreline of one of the man-made cooling ponds. The pond is an artificial water reservoir that was once used for cooling heated water in the reactors of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This farm, located on the small body of water, was converted into a radiological laboratory up until 1996. The Laboratory of Hydrobiology tested the effects of radioactivity on fish, who were considered the most radiosensitive aquatic organisms. Since the fish in the cooling pond were highly exposed, it made for the perfect place to conduct research. Many of the rusted fish pens can still be found along its banks. Inside the fish farm turned lab is a room containing a large number of preserved fish specimens. Although they are remarkably preserved, it's still as gross as it sounds. Considering it's a former scientific facility, you'd think they'd have professional equipment like beakers, vials and whatnot. Nope, the specimens are stored in what looks like recycled food containers. Think mayo or pickle jars, and there are a lot of them. In the 2000s, the Chernobyl Radio-Ecological Center took over the buildings to do more research, but eventually the base was abandoned. After the lab closed, most equipment and tools were taken or looted, but the abandoned facility still has some interesting stuff inside. Aside from the dead fish in pickle jars, that is. There's still a fish hatchery, cages for fish-eating mammals, and other reminders of what the facility once was. Coming in at number 4, we have OBGYN chair. Everyone knows that abandoned hospitals are creepy as hell, but the one in Chernobyl really takes the cake. After the nuclear disaster, the Pripyat hospital became overwhelmed with sick and injured citizens being treated for radiation. Along with the rest of the city, it was eventually evacuated and everything was left behind. Today, the hospital remains abandoned, but still contains equipment, tools, and rotting furniture. Outside of the dilapidated hospital is a haunting scene. Crooked trees damaged by radiation are growing haphazardly around the building, and there's a rusted OBGYN examination chair that's absolutely nightmare-inducing. The chair looks like something Jigsaw would use to torture someone, and the fact that it's been meticulously placed is beyond bizarre. It's clearly been staged by either a tour guide or someone looking for the perfect shot for Instagram, but still very creepy. Inside the hospital is just as scary. The bones of the once functional hospital are still there, but it's now covered in peeling paint, moss, mold, and rust. Also worthy of a mention are the rusted skeletons of baby cribs in the maternity ward. So unsettling and just plain sad. In at number 3 we have gas masks. It's no surprise that Chernobyl is filled with gas masks, given the nature of the disaster, but it doesn't take away from just how creepy they look. Not to mention just how many were left behind. They've been photographed all over the exclusion zone, some placed on creepy dolls, and others just strewn across the ghostly ruins. There are 5 secondary schools in Pripyat, and middle school number 3 is home to an ungodly amount of gas masks. Hundreds are scattered across the floor, along with a doll head for some reason. And it's become a top interest for photographers. The most unsettling part is that these Russian-made gas masks are child size. They would have been kept on site during the Cold War era to protect against nuclear, biological, and chemical attack. If you're interested in this kind of morbid memorabilia, you can actually purchase a gas mask from Chernobyl on eBay and other marketplaces. Off topic, but you can also buy vodka distilled with water from below the town of Chernobyl. It's called Atomic. Pretty on the nose with that name. Coming in at number 2 we have dolls. After the nuclear disaster, the residents in the exclusion zone had to evacuate and abandon their personal possessions, never to return home. Scattered among the wreckage is an abundance of abandoned toys, specifically decrepit dolls. Many of these dolls have succumbed to the elements with missing eyes, missing limbs, and matted hair. The dolls serve as a reminder of everything that was lost in Chernobyl, including innocence. However, since it's become a hotspot for dark tourism, it's more than likely that some of these dolls have been placed there to up the creep factor. Having said that, it's terrifying nonetheless. One haunting photo is of a decapitated doll resting its head on a windowsill. The doll itself is incredibly scary, with a missing eye, dirty skin, and wild hair. As mentioned before, there are numerous dolls that have been fashioned with gas masks. Some have also been artfully placed on the skeletons of rotting beds. It's dramatic, but effective for sure. A lot of these haunted dolls weren't actually from the time of the accident, but some of them were, and they bore witness to the horrific accident and traumatic aftermath. And lastly, coming in at number 1 we have the Ferris Wheel. The Pripyat amusement park has become an unsettling symbol for the Chernobyl disaster, and the abandoned Ferris Wheel is the most iconic. Surrounding it are bumper cars, a carousel, and a big swing, all with elements painted bright yellow. The bones of these rides have since rusted, and nature has started to reclaim the area. The bumper cars are covered in moss and brush, and the swing has trees growing within it. Still, the park has become a hotspot for tourism and photography. It was even featured in a map for Call of Duty 4. Just before the reactor melted down, the amusement park was part of an upcoming event in the city's park and was meant to open 5 days after the accident. Obviously, the disaster foiled their May Day celebration, so the city decided to open it for a couple of hours to entertain people before they announced the impending evacuation. The amusement park served as a final place of happiness and normality for many people, and there's something incredibly beautiful and sad about that.
Number 5. Pigs and boars. This infamous piglet you're seeing right now is one of the most extreme examples of radiation mutations found inside Chernobyl. It's the corpse of a stillborn piglet that was born on a nearby farm to the zone shortly after the blast. Its body was preserved and resides in the Kiev Chernobyl Museum, serving as a grim reminder of the horrifying effects like this on the local population. It's far from just the farm pigs that were affected by the blast, however. To this day, the boars surrounding Chernobyl are still irradiated. Now, an irradiated boar on paper might sound exciting, maybe to you, maybe to me. Maybe it sounds like the kind of thing you'd clear out of a super duper mart in Fallout 4, but in practice, it's a dangerous nuisance to locals in surrounding regions, where wild boar meat is popular in stews and other cooking. Unfortunately, you can't really tell just by, eyeballing a boar whether or not it's irradiated or not. They don't glow green or anything helpful, although that would be great. You wouldn't even need to have streetlights if they did that. You just let all the irradiated boars fill up the night. The unfortunate thing is that the boars are irradiating themselves on their own food source. They're eating from wild mushrooms, and the soil has been so infested. This is where things get terrifying, to really hammer home how dangerous a radiation spill is. The radiation from Chernobyl passed through the air, where it's rooted into the soil in the Czech Republic, where it steeps into the agriculture. A terrifying statistic from 2017 states that 1 in every 3 boars bagged by hunters was radioactive. Now, if you're a Czech viewer and you're getting a little bit panicked, it should be mentioned, first of all, radiated boar meat, it's one of those things where like a little bit as a treat is fine. You know, don't have a radiated boar meat every single day of your life, but hey, a little bit's not so bad for you. It's like sugar. The Czech government inspected 614 pigs processed into meat between 2014 and 2016 and discovered that over 300 of them were too radioactive to eat. So, this hazardous meat had been banned from use altogether. So unless you're specifically going out looking for it, you should be safe to try the goulash the next time you're wandering up the Czech Republic. Now, a little question I have. 300 of those were considered too radioactive. What is the acceptable level of radiation in your meat? How irradiated is something allowed to be before they put a sticker on it? Do you think it's one of those things where if it's just too irradiated, they mark it down for 50% off at the grocery store like expired sushi? Just a little something to think about for you at home. And if you're looking for more creepy content, stories from Chernobyl, natural disasters, ghosts, goblins, aliens, cryptids, and just about everything spooky under the sun and above it, Top 5 Scary is the place to be, baby. Drop a subscribe or a like and stay scared all night long. Let's keep moving. Number 4. Mutant Cows. Surrounding the areas of Chernobyl was a lot of rich, tillable soil, bountiful and just asking to be plowed. This meant one of the more common trades around the zone was farming, and meant there was a significant amount of livestock populating Chernobyl. When the radiation first burst, many people evacuating from the zone saw their livelihoods being taken from them, and decided to take their cows with them as they left. That's fair, I wouldn't leave the cows behind either, you don't want them turning into Brahmin. While this generation of refugee cows seemed okay, it was when the next generation of baby cows were born that dark problems began to arise. Farmers were noticing that they had an absurdly high rate of defected, malformed, and mutated baby calves being born. Now, sometimes the mutations would be fairly simple defects like a missing eye, or sometimes they'd be extreme, like the internal organs being all messed up, all the way to outwardly horrifying, looking like something out of a David Cronenberg flick, with cows being born with their spines twisted around, their heads contorted, or born with extra limbs or not the right amount of limbs. Basically no good answer. Luckily, or tragically, depending on your view of things, very few of these mutant calves ever lived for more than a few hours. Basically just enough time to get into the world, see the horrors that they were brought into, and check out. Nature is very impressive, but if you get born with all of your organs on the outside, you don't have a fair shot at things. Future generations of calves would straighten out, but that doesn't mean things were all clear just yet. It just meant that the contamination was getting more internal. Future generations of calves were starting to produce milk that was laced with radiation, which probably gave it a bit of a zesty flavor, and I'm sure gives you some latent superpower. You could be the amazing cowman, capable of producing. And you know what? Actually, I'm not going to finish that thought. We're going to take that one back to the drawing board before I pitch that to Marvel. Besides, I think cowman might be a bit of an oxymoron. Number 3. Birds. Many creatures have not fared well adapting to the horrors of the exclusion zone. Creatures like bees, butterflies, grasshoppers, and dragonflies all died off in record numbers. Most likely because animals like these all lay their eggs in soil, which has unfortunately been completely poisoned by radioactivity. Now, among the many creatures affected by the blast, but still living in the zone, are some small species of birds that soar the skies around Pripyat, able to lay their eggs away from the toxicity of the ground. Now, although most species of birds have either died off or fled the area, there are some that still inhabit the areas around the exclusion zone. One of the most common birds affected by the radiation is the barn swallow. It's a beautiful little bird, but it's been changed a lot. It's unknown if these birds have been mutated by radiation, or if they're naturally trying to adapt and evolving in a way that doesn't quite make sense. Scientists and researchers don't know too if they're ever going to see this specific control group of birds reverting back to the way they'd been before. A study of barn swallows ranging all the way from 1991 to 2006, so that is a lot of barn swallows, have shown that birds living in the zone are significantly more abnormal than birds outside of it. They range from aesthetic differences, like, an albino barn swallow, or they've got the wrong color feather here and there and it just makes them seem a little bit more unique. And then there's some of the more gross disfigurations and deformations like a twisted beak or a bent tail feather, maybe an eye that doesn't open up, and then there's the horrifying ones like air sacs being deformed and birdie organs being in the wrong places or large tumors all over the bird's body. What's really interesting though, maybe this is the wrong use of the word interesting. Interesting to me, a guy who only looks at, pictures of mutated animals and horrible things. None of the birds studied appeared to display more than one abnormality at a time, like they didn't have room in their little birdie bodies. The Chernobyl specimens also frequently had cataracts and were flying literally blind, and were shown on average to have much smaller brains. Talk about a real bird brain. A real irradiated, blind, tumorous bird brain. Number 2, spiders. Hey, let's not kid ourselves here. If there was one creature on the planet, one creature that we would most want to be radioactive, it has to be a spider, right? I know some of you at home might not like spiders. I'm personally kind of ambivalent towards them, but a radioactive spider, that carries the extremely high possibility of being able to turn a young boy into a noble Spider-Man and allow him to spin a web any size and catch crooks just like flies, which has always been one of my biggest career plans. Well, the spiders that inhabit Chernobyl in the exclusion zone definitely are radioactive. That much is true. But a bite from one of them won't have you swinging in between skyscrapers in Queens, dodging the Green Goblin's pumpkins anytime soon. It'll probably just make you horrifyingly sick. Radioactive spiders is literally comic book stuff, and yet populating Chernobyl, they are all just hanging in there. They're not nearly as abundant as they were prior to the blast, living in significantly reduced numbers, which is probably a positive to some people, but they still pose a very dangerous threat for wildlife and visitors regardless. What makes them truly scary is it isn't just the spiders that are irradiated that you need to watch out for, but the webs they produce now are infected with radioactivity. Now, it's not all scary, because personally I find this next part absolutely fascinating. The irradiated spiders are spinning webs that are different patterns than a normal spider would. That's like so cool. They don't spin in traditional hexagonal webs, but rather these like sweet psychedelic patterns that would look absolutely perfect on one of those posters to shine a black light on. You know the ones I mean. Curiously, scientists aren't 100% sure why the irradiated spider webs are coming out looking like this. But look, do not touch them, as walking through these webs have proven to be pretty hazardous. Having to avoid radioactive webs in the wilderness of an abandoned nuclear city sounds like it'd be like really cool if I was playing Stalker or something, but I think I am good where I am, where there might be spiders and they might be kind of gross, but they're not particularly irradiated whatsoever. Number 1, dogs. One of the more common creatures out in the zone is a humble puppy. The dogs of Chernobyl have a rich culture and are an interesting biological study. They're born from a tragic history, as the dogs that populate the zone are the descendants of abandoned dogs when the evacuation order was first placed. They're like a little gang of renegade dogs. Renegade wasteland survivor dogs. Like, they're all dog meat. That's so cool. Pripyat and the surrounding villages were abandoned almost overnight, and residents weren't allowed to take their pets with them. Stories tell of dogs howling, clawing, trying to get onto the buses with their owners. Oh, I'm actually gonna start crying in the video. Soldiers pulled them off the buses. Squads went in and hunted down the dogs of the zone in an effort to clear any active contaminants. Those that managed to survive would carry the lineage to the next generation. And quick aside here, but would that not make an amazing movie following the story of these wasteland survivor dogs who had to escape getting hunted by soldiers? Anyway, it's their descendants that now populate the outskirts of the zone. The wild pups of Chernobyl look identical to a dog you'd find anywhere else in the world. No extra fangs or glowing eyes or anything, but there is concern that there are trace amounts of radiation in their fur. You get a little bit of a zap when you're petting them. Unfortunately, these dogs don't live very long. The higher ages tend to be around 5 to 6, but they are beloved by visitors of Chernobyl. They've become sort of the unofficial mascot of the place. A volunteer group called the Dogs of Chernobyl capture them, they vaccinate the dogs, and ID tag them. Some of the doggies too are fitted with Geiger counter collars, that's so cute, allowing researchers to get eyes and paws on the ground in places they wouldn't normally be able to, as they track them as they hop, skip, and jump around the wild of the exclusion zone. Now, there's no rules enforced about the dogs, obviously, because there's not a whole lot of law going on in Chernobyl, but guides who do visits to Chernobyl ask people to please exercise caution, as they could genuinely be irradiated. But at the core, despite the hardships of their environment, the hellish conditions they had to grow in, the puppies of Chernobyl they're still just puppies. They're playful, adorable, loving, loyal creatures who just have a little bit too much radiation for me to snuggle them.